It happened, guys. The big one. Joe Rogan, Wes Huff. The conversation to end them all.
Wes, very nice to meet you.
Joe, pleasure.
The online Christian world has been very excited about this conversation taking place. We have a well-rounded Christian apologist going on a massive podcast. I think that is good reason to be excited. Getting an excellent apologist who understands things like the Bible, early church history, textual and manuscript issues, and so on is something I've wanted for a very long time. Joe Rogan has had some people on there that have spoken about these things before, but I've been waiting for a really solid apologist to have a conversation with Joe and interact with Joe's questions. Joe has made some interesting statements in the past, such as bringing up the idea of mass hallucinations when talking about the issue of Jesus appearing to all of the folks after his resurrection.
There's people that have mass hallucinations all the time about a lot of things, and there's people that you could give them false memory. False memory is a real thing.
And so as I've seen him talk about this over time, I'm like, there are people who can interact with these questions very thoughtfully, and I want to see that happen. Now, this is just going to kind of be a stream of consciousness. I listened to the whole thing and took notes, and I'm just going to move through my notes. Now, overall, I think this is a lovely example of a kind-hearted conversation between a Christian and a non-Christian. And Wes, it felt like he was being very intentional with the conversation while letting Joe guide it. He spent a lot of time just answering Joe's questions, and they went all over the place. Most of the conversation was meandering into all sorts of different issues and things that Joe was interested in.
When you deal with 2,300,000 stones in the Great Pyramid, and some of them like 50 tons, 60 tons.
That's pretty crazy.
500 miles away. Like, what did you do?
And a lot of times Joe was kind of pulling Wes out of his area of expertise, and Wes he'd go along and he would have really interesting thoughts.
Even just looking at the Sphinx, you can tell that no matter what your perspective is, you should entertain the idea, at minimum, that the head was built later.
Yeah, for sure.
Because it doesn't fit the body.
Sometimes he would say, "You're taking me out of my lane here," and then he would proceed to give a wonderfully intelligent answer out of his lane. Now, I don't think this was nefarious on Joe's part, but I did find it irritating at times that we were spending time talking about things that were really, going outside of Wes's expertise instead of spending that time talking about the things that are directly within his realm.
Yeah.
Jamie, did you find that thing about the dark matter?
And Wes did a really good job calmly navigating that. Another thing I think he did well was theology. A lot of times what can happen when you get Christian historians in a conversation is they're really good at the historian part, but their Bible knowledge is not as well-rounded. I think Wes is very well-rounded in his theological understanding of things as well. And so we have that pairing, and I think that's super important and really wonderful. His ability to articulate biblical teachings is also well-rounded. From what I've seen, it seems like some people are perhaps concerned that he didn't share the gospel in this conversation. And I would argue that he did a couple of different times, but also that was an undertone in the conversation. Now, could he have been more direct with it at times? Perhaps. But I do think that the gospel message was on display in this conversation. And I'll get there. But first, I just want to move through the timeline of the conversation, my notes, and things I thought were interesting. So Joe starts off talking about Billy Carson and that whole debacle. And that's obviously a catalyst for how Wes ended up on his show to begin with. One of the things that Joe said that I thought was really interesting, it was a good articulation of a key problem with the whole Billy Carson thing, is Billy Carson said that because he was sick, he had been in the hospital, that he was not capable to articulate or argue properly for his positions. And Joe made the point that on the things that he's an expert in, you could wake him up at 4 a.m. and he could articulate his positions on that. And I thought that was a good way to put that. They also spoke about the whole vitriolic and legal battle that came out of the whole thing, which is, of course, very sad. And then very interestingly, Joe, in referring to the debate between Wes and Billy Carson, said that Wes was clearly correct and Billy was exposed. So that's, wow.
When he was on with you, it was quite apparent that you are an actual expert in the Bible and in many religious texts, and that he didn't necessarily have the facts straight. When you get caught with your pants down, you're supposed to say, I got caught with my pants down.
Yeah.
That's what you're supposed to do. Like,
Yeah.
it's the only, especially if you're public, like, it's very clear that you're incorrect.
And then as we move through the conversation, you can see that Joe is quite impressed by Wes's experience and knowledge. And there definitely seemed to be a rapport between the two there.
Like 4,000 years ago, we only really have a tiny little statue of him.
I guess he was busy making a pyramid.
So they say, right?
Joe spent a lot of time being quiet and listening, which I thought was pretty cool. And Joe is, of course, an iconic interviewer, and he will methodically press you with questions that he finds interesting. As they move along, they talk about Wes's background a little bit. They talk about Mormonism a little bit. A very interesting part comes when the Isaiah scroll from the Dead Sea Scrolls is brought up.
When we're talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls, like, you have ones like the Great Isaiah Scroll, which is fully complete. Like, it's a copy of the book of Isaiah, and it's a full, complete scroll. But then other ones are so fragmentary that we think they're written in Hebrew, but we can't actually tell.
Oh, wow.
Because no one's willing to, like, piece these. And this is true for a lot of stuff.
So when you say the book of Isaiah is intact, how similar is it to the book of Isaiah that's in the Bible?
So that one is fascinating. So this isn't true for all of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but when we discovered the Great Isaiah Scroll, previous to that, the earliest copy of Isaiah that we had was in the Masoretic text, which is in the Middle Ages.
Whoa.
Yeah, so it was literally 1,000 years. We literally pushed back our understanding of Isaiah 1,000 years. And the thing that really shocked scholars, like I said, this isn't true for all of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but one of the things that shocked them about Isaiah was that it was word for word identical to the Masoretic text.
Word for word.
Word for word.
Wow.
Hi, Amendment James here. So there's been some controversy around Wes's statements about the Isaiah scroll here when he says it's word for word identical. And well, there are at least a couple of people that I know of who have brought up objections to this, citing variants. Wes has made a video on his channel where he is addressing this and making some corrections, and Dan McClellan has made his own corrections. And also Gavin Ortland made a great video responding to those objections. I'm not going to personally tackle all of that in this video, I just wanted to mention it. Now back to non-amendment James. And as I said, Wes was letting Joe guide the conversation and ask questions. He was answering his questions. And then it seemed like Wes would pivot the conversation into directions that he about things he wanted to share. And it was done in a very kind of gentle and pleasant and welcomed way. So I guess a conversational tip out of this could be to let a conversation flow and then step into relevant topics to set yourself up to give information and context to those topics. There's also a point around the 48-minute mark where Joe asked Wes a question and Wes said, "That's a good question. I don't know how to answer that."
It's very close.
So when they conquered them, did they have their own writing system initially and just incorporated Sumerian writing to theirs?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that one.
And I appreciated that. I think that this is an important thing to be able to do in a conversation with somebody because none of us have perfect, all-knowing knowledge, right? We're all learning as we go. And if you can say, I'm not sure what the answer is to that, that takes the wind out of the fearfulness that can come up around these types of conversations. So I think it's important to be comfortable with that. At one point, they're talking about the flood of Noah and the Epic of Gilgamesh, and there's a trend of Joe going as far into the past as possible in these conversations, into the fuzziness that is 3,000 plus years ago. And I'm sitting here going, let's talk about the early church. That sounds like fun. We have a lot of information about that comparatively to these things. Hi. You got a cheese stick? Now, I was a little concerned going through this conversation because I was thinking if we just hang out here the whole time, we're going to miss out on some important key issues that are within Wes's expertise in regard to the Christian faith. Luckily, we do end up back in that place. Joe doesn't want to spelunk.
Like some of these caves, you're like basically crawling on your stomach, which is terrifying because people have died that way.
Are you claustrophobic?
No, I'm not claustrophobic. Not normal
You
stuff.
just don't want to crawl in a
I don't
cave?
want to crawl in the middle of the earth into something that's like 11 inches high.
Yeah.
Like squirming slowly. That's what they're doing. Like,
Yeah.
their body barely fits in there.
Something I can't agree with him on. That's terrifying. Okay, sorry. I had a filming interruption. My daughter just got sick. We've had a cold going around the house. She's napping now. Now, one thing that Joe and Wes seem to agree on is this idea that science, secular science, requires one miracle, and it's called the Big Bang.
Terence McKenna had a great line that said that science requires one miracle. The Big Bang.
Totally.
It requires a miracle.
Well, I always say that when people ask me about, the miracles in the Bible.
Yeah.
And I say, well, if the first miracle happened, if everything, nothing became everything,
Right.
then, Jesus turning water into wine.
That's an easy one.
Well, yeah.
That's a party trick.
Yeah, exactly.
It really is nothing compared to the birth of the universe, but we're convinced at the creation of the universe, and we're very skeptical at other miracles. Which is very odd.
This is common ground that they found in this conversation, which is pretty cool. And Wes actually calls back to that common ground later on in the conversation. We'll get there. Now, around the 2 hour and 19-minute mark, we get to some Jesus-related conversation. Very exciting. Wes lays a foundation of basic facts about Christ that a lot of people tend to agree on in a very historian type of manner.
So what is your personal belief when it comes to the resurrection? What do you think do you have a belief, or do you just try to interpret the text and try to see what is the message?
As a historian, I do think it is a historical question. You have a guy who objectively lived, he objectively died, and then individuals close to his inner circle claim that they see him not dead.
Right.
Again.
This is a highly unusual activity.
Highly unusual.
Right.
And as they're talking about Christ, one of the things that Joe brings up that he brought up many times in the conversation is the idea that people were illiterate in that time and that they thought so differently than we think today.
But it's hard when you're dealing with illiterate populations, you're dealing with thousands of years of time, you're dealing with an oral tradition, and then you have us sitting here talking about it in 2024, trying to figure it at the end of 2024, trying to figure this out.
They didn't have a problem with people doing miracles or crazy things happening or...
Well, that's also why it's so interesting trying to put your mind into the context of people that lived back then when you try to interpret what these stories were all about, because they did believe in things that weren't real. So when they talk about this thing that we're supposed to believe is real, when you have all this evidence that they believe things that aren't true, it's interesting, right? Because like you're now saying, yeah, but this one really was true.
The implication is that casts so much murkiness on how to interpret what was going on at that time. But I think this is a bit overstated, because just because they're not as educated as we are doesn't mean they couldn't think and reason. And I mean, you could see it in the biblical texts. These are people who could obviously read and write. There's a logic to what's going on there. These aren't like monkey people running around hitting things with rocks. Yes, they thought differently than we did, but I think we have to be careful about what that means.
Right.
Well, there's so many different things that they thought of and believed that weren't true.
Yeah. So this historiographically is, so when we do history, it's an inference to the best explanation. And so there are probabilities of things that have happened in history where we can say, okay, there's a higher probability of event A happening and a lower probability of event B happening. The example I often give is like Jonah being swallowed by the fish. That's low probabilistically, not that it didn't happen, but that like as a historian, we got to like say, well, there's no independent cross-reference sources. You don't have multiple attestation for this particular event. The interesting thing about Jesus is that we have more evidence from different writings in the ancient world than we probably should have for someone of his stature. Because we have Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, these 4 biographies. There's really only one other person in and around that time that can claim to have that much kind of independent testimony of their life and it's the Roman Emperor Tiberius. So he also has 4 biographers. He has Cassio Dio, Suetonius, Tacitus, and Velleius Paterculus. The Roman emperor, who's the most famous, most powerful person at the time, has a similar amount of historiographical evidence biographically for his, the events of his lifetime that Jesus does.
But another thing that happened in this moment is, here it is, common ground with Joe. When they're talking about the resurrection, Wes says, well, we both agree that life is not just material. Something bigger is going on here, right? And so he pulled on that common ground with Joe and connected it to the resurrection, which was very interesting.
It's very difficult for anybody who thinks of themselves as an intelligent person who's secular to even entertain the possibility that someone died and come back to life.
And I get that. But we've already talked about the fact that we don't think that the only thing that exists is matter and motion. We as in you and I, right? Like, we believe that there's something else going on in this world that's a little bit crazy.
And then they start talking about the post-resurrection appearances. And Wes talks about 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul talks about that.
But the Gospels are written in the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. And they're written in this period of time where you have groups of individuals who could have fact-checked those things. So,
how do you fact-check someone coming back from the dead?
Well,
How many people saw his body, right?
Well, Paul says that 400 people saw him all at once.
400 people saw the crucifixion?
No, saw the resurrected Jesus. Yeah, 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says that Jesus appeared to the disciples, and then he appeared to 400 people all at once.
And I think that's such a great reference. I mentioned it in the Jordan Peterson video recently, because we have Paul making these claims, and then later on in the chapter, he's saying that if Christ has not raised from the dead, our faith is in vain, and we are to be pitied. So he is pointing to the seriousness of the truthfulness of these claims. The accounts that we find in the New Testament were written during the time that the people who would have witnessed these events were still alive. And Paul mentions that in 1 Corinthians 15. And then Joe starts inquiring about the crucifixion. Is it possible that Jesus didn't really die? And then he brings in this bizarre story about an organ donor who woke up.
Do you think it's possible that he didn't die? And do you think it's possible that they thought he was dead? Because that does happen. There was actually a case very recently where a guy was about to be harvested for organs. They thought he was dead, and this guy started moving again and came back to life. It's a very, very bizarre case.
These are the types of arguments that Joe will make a lot in kind of pressing on these claims. And then Wes explains the hideousness and the unsurvivability of crucifixion.
Yeah, I mean, we know a lot about Roman crucifixion, and
Pretty
we know
brutal.
that, and we know that they did their job well.
Yeah.
And so, in fact, if you look at, say, very skeptical biblical scholars, like non-believing, atheist, agnostic Christian scholars, they will say if we can know anything about Jesus, like they'll cast a doubt on a lot of the things that we read about in the Gospels in terms of the actual historical Jesus of Nazareth. They'll say one thing we can be sure of is that he died by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. Because we have not just multiple attested documents that we refer to as the New Testament, but Roman and Greek and Jewish writers refer to that claim afterwards.
And then Wes, once again, is very much approaching this from a historian standpoint, and he's arguing like a historian. For example, Joe asked how many witnesses wrote about it, and he mentioned the accounts in the New Testament, but he's treating them as accounts. He's not treating them as, first and foremost, books in the Bible as we would see them now, but accounts of what happened. Now, I think it's important that we understand both of those things, that they are historical accounts, but that they're also the Word of God. But it's important that both of those things are understood. So Wes was giving a great depiction of the early evidence around the resurrection. And something he got to that I really appreciated was the idea that women were the first witnesses to the empty tomb. And this is significant because women weren't seen as reliable witnesses in that time. If you were trying to start a movement that was successful in this time, what you would not do is have women as witnesses to a key event. And Wes gives some evidence to this later on when he talks about the docetic gospel of Peter, which was uncomfortable with women being the witnesses of the resurrection, the initial witnesses.
The docetic gospel of Peter seems to be uncomfortable with the fact that the biblical gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, have women being the first witnesses to the empty tomb. Because in the ancient world, women were not seen as good eyewitnesses. So you almost have this apologetic trying to solve that problem by having all the right people be witness to the resurrection. So you have all the Roman and Jewish officials camping out in front of the tomb, which also gives away the fact that like no Jewish priest on the eve of Passover is going to be camping out in front of a dead body. Like they didn't do that.
Now around 2 hours and 39 minutes, they start talking about Constantine. And the reason why I bring this up is because it points to the fact that between the beginning in the first century and around 313, where you have the Edict of Milan, which was an edict of tolerance, there was persecution of the Christian church. It was a dispersed, persecuted people. So it wasn't like the Christians were able to get together and have these big organized councils about the Canon or something like that. And then you mentioned something that I had either learned and forgot or didn't realize, which is that Constantine carried out these massive projects to put together all the books of the canon into one big volume. And then Codex Sinaiticus, they think, may have been one of these massive projects, which brings us back around to Billy Carson, because that was part of their conversation, the beginning of their conversation. Billy said that it claimed that Jesus wasn't crucified, and Wes said it does, it's just the Bible. And then Billy said, oh, I meant this other one. I forget the exact writing that you mentioned. So all throughout this conversation, Wes was just giving all sorts of good information. And they had some great discussion on the canon.
So very early on, when you have Christians having these conversations, the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, there's unanimous agreement about those, particularly, and that's not to say that there aren't other Gospels that pop up. It's that you have this chain of custody that goes back to the earliest Jesus community. Jesus has disciples, and there's a group of individuals who we call the Apostolic Fathers, who are the disciples of Jesus' disciples. And so they comment on the books that the disciples of Jesus, or that people within the community of the disciples of Jesus wrote. Very early on, because the New Testament has 27 books in it, very early on, 24 of the 27 are unanimously accepted. So by the time you get to the middle of the 2nd century, we have lists in documents like there's a document called the Muratorium Fragment, which there's debate on its dating, but it's probably like mid to late 2nd century. And it includes 24 of the 27.
This is such an important area that so many people know so little about. And then there's one point where I think Wes points to the gospel, and that is when he says, the Jewish scriptures were seen as a story in search of a conclusion.
The Jewish scriptures in Jesus' day were seen as a story in search of a conclusion, because they were looking for this figure, this Mashiach, the Messiah, who would come and fulfill things like the reign of David. So they're talking about these things. They're actually expecting them to happen. And so the story in search of a conclusion in the Christian understanding is that Jesus is that individual. He comes and he does things like he says at the Last Supper right before his crucifixion, that he's establishing a new covenant in his blood.
Now, is this directly articulating exactly what Jesus did as a fulfillment of those things? No, but it demands the question, what is the conclusion? So I think that was good. And then a bit later on, Joe says some things about atheism that I've never heard him say.
Atheists, they vary just like Christians vary, but the worst versions of them are essentially believers in the religion of atheism.
Right.
They worship the concept of there being no God, and this is it. When you die, nothing happens.
Yeah.
That to me is always so arrogant. Just the fact that you exist at all is so bizarre and so spectacular. The idea that you know for sure that when the lights shut out, that's a wrap, like, because there's no evidence of the contrary. Well, okay. Well,
Kind of assuming your conclusion there.
Absence of evidence is not evidence. It's especially when you're talking about something that's as bizarre as death.
Mm-hmm.
And especially when you have people that have near-death experiences that are radically similar.
Yeah.
Those are really weird. They're really weird how many similarities people have in these near-death experiences from accidents and all sorts of things that people come back from, where their heart stops beating, they see themselves above their body. There's a lot of weirdness to it that makes you, I just think it's a little silly, because how could you know what you don't know?
Yeah.
You cannot know what you don't know. The problem is that there's a cachet, that there's a social credit amongst academics in particular that's ascribed to a person who is atheist, a person who is, he's brilliant, he's not silly, he doesn't believe in myths, he doesn't. I get it. I get why there's social pressure in that regard. I get it. But to not look at the universe itself, just this creation engine of planets and stellar nurseries, just the bizarreness of the epicness of it all, and to not wonder if maybe you have a very narrow perception of what this whole thing is all about.
Yeah. Deny the virgin birth, but not the virgin birth of the universe.
Yeah. Well, all of it.
I thought this was pretty cool. And once again, it was a bit of common ground that they had. Now, one quick point about common ground. I think we have to remember as Christians that the difference between us and people who are not Christians is the Holy Spirit. I think as we have these very thoughtful and scholarly conversations, we can run the risk of making too much of common ground when we have to remember that one has to be made alive by the Holy Spirit. We're not saving anybody, and we're not saving anybody by common ground. We're used as a means for the Holy Spirit to work in somebody's heart. And then finally at the end, at 3 hours and 5 minutes, Wes asks Joe what he thinks of Jesus.
In all of this, what do you think of Jesus? Like in terms of your own like journeying and trying to find answers to ultimate questions. What do you think of the historical person of Jesus?
Well, it certainly seems like there's a lot of people that believe that there was this very exceptional human being that existed. So the question is, what does that mean? Does it mean he was the Son of God? Does it mean he was just some completely unique human being that had this vision of humanity and this way of educating people and spreading this ideology that would ultimately change the way human beings interact with each other forever? So what is he the Son of God? Well, are we all? That's another question, right? Do we all have that inside of us? Do we all have that ability to change everything around us inside of us? Do we all have that unique connection to the divine? And is he a representation of the best version of that? Or was he an actual person that was the Son of God? And is it important?
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, what does it mean? It's just the fact that it's a question to ponder is a miracle in itself, in a way. Just the fact that there's this concept of this person that died for our sins as the Son of God, but you have to you have to believe in a bunch of stuff to go that way. Like, just the concept of that is interesting to people, because what it can do to people is offer them a very unique way to change the way they feel about the world itself. And if you do follow that, I know a lot of Christians are hardcore Christians. They're some of the nicest people you'll ever meet in your life. So it does work, right? Like, if you do live like a Christian and you do follow the principles of Christ, you will have a richer, more love-filled life. So it is true, right? But you have to submit to this concept that this guy was the child of God who came down to earth, let himself be crucified, came back from the dead, explained a bunch of stuff for people, and then said, all right, see you when I come back.
Now, I won't go too much into detail here. I think it's good that Wes asked that question, but I think Joe is ignoring a lot of the context of the New Testament when he's making these statements. He's claiming these different claims about who the Son of God would be, and he's saying, like, are we all the Son of God? We have Jesus over here claiming to be the Son of what? Those are disconnected worldviews. They're completely different questions, right? Is Jesus the Son of God in the biblical sense? Are we sons of God? Those are two very different questions. I wish Joe would have interacted more with the stuff they were talking about in the conversation, and also the context found in the Bible for who Jesus is and if he believed in that. But yeah, it's safe to say at this point that Joe still does not have a Christian perspective on Jesus. And of course, we should keep praying for him and hoping that he will receive salvation. Now, finally, near the end, at 3 hours and 10 minutes, they mention Jordan Peterson. And then Wes goes on to make another touch on the gospel. Wes, in addressing his issues with the way that Jordan Peterson approaches the Bible, mentions how the law is spoken about by Jesus in the New Testament and how Jesus was interacting with the Jews about that. And as he's doing that, he mentions that Jesus teaches that the law reveals that you're dirty. It's not meant to save you, and that you can't do enough to live up to the standard of God's holiness.
I actually think that Jesus condemns moralism. And ultimately what I see Peterson doing is looking at Jesus as a moral example. And if Jesus is nothing but a moral example, then you can save yourself and you don't actually need a savior. And so I think actually Jesus would have critiqued that because Jesus was very against moralism.
And how do you define Jesus being against moralism? Like, what do you mean by that exactly?
Well, Jesus looks at the religiosity of his day with like particular groups like the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who are these other groups of Jews during his day. So we talked about the Essenes, who actually aren't mentioned in the Bible, but there are other groups like the Pharisees, who are like lay scholars, and the Sadducees, who are professional priest scholars. He's constantly critiquing the fact that they have this hypocritical religiosity to them, where they're doing things like tithing their mint leaves, like to make sure that they get all of, this is where we get the idea of the letter of the law versus the intention of the law. Like Jesus critiques them for that because he says, you're trying to do everything right and you're missing the point. And what he's getting to is like, what's the intention? What's the meaning of the law that God gives to you? Because the law is like a mirror. It shows you how dirty you are. But his critique is he's like, you guys are trying to clean yourself with a mirror. That's stupid. It's just going to, if anything, it's going to make you more messy. Like, get in the shower. The law is not what cleans you. The law is what reveals that you're dirty. And so in that sense, I think, if Jesus is a moral example, it actually misses what I think Jesus actually said about what his purpose was, in that you can't do enough to actually live up to the standard that God holds you to. And so if you keep striving, you're actually going to wear yourself out and be exhausted.
Like atheists.
I didn't say you did, Joe.
A lot of them go crazy. They go crazy when they get older.
Once again, it's a presentation of the problem, and the implication, while not stated overtly here, is that Jesus is the solution to that problem. Now, could he have gone on to say Jesus is the solution to the problem? Yes, and I think that would have been a cool way to wrap up the conversation, but he didn't. But you saw that implication there. But overall, like I said, I think this was an example of a kind-hearted, pleasant conversation between somebody who is a Christian and someone who is not a Christian. And the person who is a Christian happens to be very knowledgeable and well-rounded, which is awesome. I think Wes did a fantastic job. I don't think this is an easy thing to do, but he did it very well, and he demonstrated his competence. And I had a lot of fun listening to it. And I'm also super pumped for the audience it's reaching. Last time I looked, it's at 2.5 million views, and those aren't a bunch of Christians, so I'm super excited about that. But that's about it for this one, except for what I'm about to say. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to hit the subscribe button or the like button, I would really appreciate that. Please feel free to comment below. I'd love to engage with you guys. I hope you have a lovely day. God bless. Bye.